birthday than talking about 900 people who were massacred in the jungle.
Well, we all wish you a happy one.
Hey, thanks. And thanks for coming out. So we're going to talk about Jimmy.
Well, I hope we'll talk about People's Temple and anything else that comes up. We're here tonight, you know, for these folks, so should we sing happy birthday to you before we start?
No, we should not.
I think that's wise.
But I want to start this where I started the book, or the review, which was the book surprised the hell out of me, and I thought I knew a little bit about Jim Jones. I certainly lived through it. And that was, I had no idea that he actually did so many things that I would consider admirable.
Well, one of the things that is true of most of us is if we decide someone is bad, we like to think they're 100% evil. Jim Jones, and I didn't know this, but when I would go to Indianapolis, and I spent a lot of time there, you're talking about a man who in the late 1940s, early 1950s, pretty much by the sheer force of his own personality, integrated one of the most segregated cities in America. And if I can give you an example, I'd like to do that.
Please.
Okay, here's Indiana, and there are not many people of color in the state, but most of them are in the industrial towns, and Indianapolis, of course, is one of the largest. There is no non-Anglo representation, mayor, city council, on the school board, anywhere. And this council, just a couple of years before Jim Jones begins his storefront ministry, they pass a rule. They very proudly announce that in the city of Indianapolis, anyone of any race may live anywhere. There are no lines. However, to be able to purchase a house within Indianapolis city limits, all the other people on the block have to vote unanimously that you can buy it. So now you have the black population of Indiana pretty much being forced into one neighborhood, which is known in the city as Frog Island. And the reason it's called Frog Island is there are canals around it with a lot of refuse and human waste. The schools on Frog Island. In Indianapolis, the school board says proudly any child may go to his or her neighborhood school. And yet the elementary school in Frog Island is the only elementary school in that school district that has no playground equipment. The high school is the only school where the students are given textbooks that are more than 40 years old. Jim Jones, and this does not excuse all the other things he did, in the course of about 6 or 7 years, changes this entirely. And there wasn't anybody else besides his long-suffering wife, Marceline, who's working with him the whole time. This is 15 years before the civil rights legislation made it mandatory. And that makes it almost harder to accept what comes. The man got his beginnings as a civic leader, as a man who worked with politicians, with school boards, with government, by achieving some very great things. Again, that makes it sadder, the way things ended up, because he had the capacity to do so much that was good.
And you hang this at the beginning of the book. You hang this horror on him. We start with the massacre. You open it with 6 pages of very compact, economical writing that paints a very dark picture, and you leave us with that. Well, you then go on to describe some very just incredible civic accomplishments. I mean, he helped the poor. He helped civil rights, pushed, I mean, to a new era, really, especially in Indianapolis.
One of the things that I found when I read a lot of the books that were written about People's Temple in Jonestown, this is not true of the books that were written by the folks that were part of People's Temple, but this happened in just about every book written by outsiders, is that the books would have about the first 30 pages devoted to Jones's life and career, and then they want to get right to Guyana, and they want, to get these horrible scenes. I tried to structure my book differently, and it was a deliberate idea. I wanted to begin the book by letting people know, yes, this is the person, these are the events you think you know about, but to tell it a different way. And when I was in Guyana, I was able to track down Colonel Desmond Roberts. And Colonel Roberts was head of the Guyanese Defense Force. And he was the one with some of his troops who came into Jonestown the day after so many folks needlessly lost their lives. And so I thought, let's start out with readers getting the Guyanese view of what's happening or isn't happening, their confusion, what they see, what they think is going on. And then from there, let's go back to Genesis so that we can begin. We know now where it's ending. Now let's go back to the beginning and see how these things happen, because it happens incrementally. Demagogues do not just come out roaring and saying things that would seem nonsensical to a lot of people or anything else. It's a gradual buildup. So I hope when you read the book, you'll understand that I'm trying to find the things that we've always assumed we knew, particularly about Jim Jones. And maybe if we get the real story, that helps us get a better perspective on what's coming up next and what is far better known.
Now I imagine Jones, and I really enjoyed your book about Manson. I thought there was revelations, things that had never been made public before, which is clear. But one thing, I thought Jones must have been much harder to write about. He was a much more complex human being. I mean, Charlie Manson was a linear criminal. Mm-hmm. Jim Jones, not so much.
Well, I didn't pick People's Temple to write about because I thought this is just going to be Manson Part 2. Comparing Charles Manson to Jim Jones is like comparing Mickey Mouse to Machiavelli. Charlie Manson was just a complete sociopathic thug from the beginning who never did anything to benefit anyone other than himself. The whole story of People's Temple is complicated. Jim Jones was not just one thing. And the members of People's Temple were all not part of that organization. I don't know whether to say church may not be the right term or not.
Church.
But because they have all different reasons. And one of the genius aspects of Jim Jones, in some ways he was, is he found ways to appeal to different kinds of people who have different kinds of ambitions and reasons for wanting to join. But the other thing that I hope all of you will keep in mind as you read the book, to me, the most unique thing about Jim Jones is that most demagogues recruit trying to appeal to the worst part of people's natures. Follow me, and together we will keep these other people from taking what is rightfully yours. Or follow me, and together we will get from people who have your thing, we're going to get your fair share. Jim Jones appealed to the best in human nature. Join me, and let's create an example for society where everyone is treated with equal dignity and respect. Now remember, this is not in 2017. This is a man who's coming forward and saying women are every bit as good as men. Race does not matter at all. You must not judge people by what they do not have or what they do own. People joined the temple to give and to help bring about a better, more generous world, not to take away from anybody.
Yes, and are there people today who won't, or maybe it's the other, I don't know the answer to this, but are there people today who are proud of their membership in that church? Because clearly they're survivors.
I think everyone who has been a part of that church, who are part of People's Temple, if they are still here, have things to be proud of. I also think all these folks, many of them call themselves the survivors, have been able to form lifelong friendships based on the realization that they have been through something that outsiders really cannot completely understand, and they have stood with each other all these years. And many of them, and God bless them, this is so impressive. I think if I had gone through all this, I would have just tried to huddle in some corner and stay away from everybody forever. And yet you see these folks, they are still socially committed, they're still trying to make the world a better place. If they tell their stories in their own books, they're not whining about how they suffered. They're trying to say, this was my experience, we can learn from it, we can move on. So yes, I think members of People's Temple have a lot to be proud of.
And how did you break through the natural barriers of an insular community like that?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily entirely insular. There have always been some members who are willing to talk, who want to help people understand. I think the important thing is if people are going to talk about something very personal, if they're going to share things with you, they have to believe, and it has to be true, that you are approaching them respectfully. I'm not interested in sensationalism, I'm just not. What I am interested in doing is trying to see what there is in history that is different than mythology, and how we can learn from it. Nothing happens in a vacuum. When Jim Jones emerges, it's not just something that happens accidentally. You go back to the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, into the 60s and 70s. So many things coming together. I only thought maybe I'm starting to understand Jim Jones when I meet his cousin, Jeannie Luther Jones. Now, Jeannie and the Jones clan, there's a bunch of them. In Lynn, Indiana, Jim Jones was the town rich kid. He liked to talk about how everything was horrible. It turns out not to be true. But I said to Jeannie one day, we're having very bad coffee in the one cafe in Lynn, and you know, writers say they sacrifice for their books. My sacrifice was the cream chicken special. That seemed to be the special every day. I said to Jeannie, where did this come from, do you think? She was the cousin closest in age to him. They grew up together. And she said, World War II. I said, why? And she said, all the other kids, all the other 11, 12, 13-year-old boys in Lynn, you know, they're Allied soldiers. They're General Patton. They're Douglas MacArthur. And I'm probably the only one in this room old enough to remember they're all saying they're Audie Murphy. No, see, all of you pretending yet, but none of you, I'm the only one old enough. Jim was fascinated, she said, from the beginning by the Nazis. It wasn't that he bought into anti-Semitism at all, but he was fascinated by the newsreels of Hitler with these huge wrapped crowds hanging on his every word, and he particularly admired the goose-stepping of the troops. And so Jim would actually take all the little cousins he could bully and take them out in the field and make them try to goose-step. And he had a switch, and he'd smack them on the calves with the switch if they wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't do it right. And she said she'll never forget, Hitler commits suicide, bunker in Berlin, he's surrounded, the enemies are close in. And she said she remembers Jimmy talking about that's the way to go. You don't ever give your enemies the satisfaction.
At a young age.
And you know, we see these things. He's 11, 12 years old. Clearly he's not doing some of the things he did later in life in Lynn, but there's all these indications. The things that he becomes are just exaggerations of the things we see in his childhood, but nobody ever goes back to try to look at that part of someone's life.
At the risk of a cliche, it's Sie Mutter, right?
Okay, we'll cliche a little.
But you open the book with a great litany about his mom.
Lynetta.
And you say, you know, she was the suffering, she gave birth to a Christ-like child, and then your punchline, none of it's true.
Jones,
she created him.
In
Literally.
part, Jim Jones was created by his mother. She was a very, shall we say, strong-willed woman Lynetta, his mother, and you can read about all the claims she made of her own childhood, which turned out not to be true. But she did believe from the beginning in reincarnation, that she, in many of her past lives, had been a great person, and that it was unfair the way the world was treating her in this life. But she would always claim, and now you've got a 4 or 5-year-old boy who's hearing this on a regular basis. She would tell him that she once had a vision, that she was dying and had come close to the river of death. And there on the shore of the river of death, she met the spirit of her own mother, who had died recently. And her mother said, "You cannot die. It is your fate to give birth to one of the greatest men who ever lived." Now, Jim Jones had plenty of bad character traits that he came by entirely on his own. But don't you think that has some effect on a child? And when later in life, he's claiming reincarnation, and, he is the reincarnation of Lenin. He said Buddha a few times. That's not just a huge step from what he's hearing from his mother all those years ago.
I thought the whole description of Sky God, Earth God was right out of his mom's playbook.
Well, Lynetta had great contempt for the regular church. In Lynn, 900 or so people, and of course that number we see again later in his life, there are 5 different churches. And on Sunday, everybody goes to church, except one family. And that's Jim Jones and his parents, until he's still a little boy. And he's fascinated by the churches, and he joins all 5. And on Sundays, he might give 10 minutes to the Methodists, then another 15 to the Nazarenes, and then run around the corner to the Presbyterians.
And creates his own ideology from that.
Jim Jones was very good at cherry picking. He had this personality where he had to be the one in power, but he also would have around him very capable, intelligent people. And he would learn from them. And his own independent church and his style of preaching becomes an amalgamation. A lot of it is stolen from some of the black churches when he's trying to get people of color into his congregation. But a lot of it goes back to the Nazarenes in Lynn, the Presbyterians. He's not an original thinker, but he is one of those very rare folks who has the ability to take from so many sources and make it appear to be something of his own. We all know people like that, don't we? Jim Jones, I think, had that character trait better than almost anybody else.
You briefly describe what the church was for people who don't know. I mean, but the construct, the philosophy behind it.
Of People's Temple? The early church, Jim Jones created his power by bringing about great, obvious social change so that members would see there was some advantage to them to begin with. And he would often say, "See, this is a church where you get something now." He would insult a church that worships a sky god that doesn't do anything for you in life, and you're just supposed to get it after death. What good is that? An earth god who's right here and cares and does something for your life. But the whole concept of People's Temple as it grew was to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and ultimately, I think, and there's lots of different versions of what it meant, and I think lots of people might use another definition. But it was for everyone together, respecting each other equally, to set such a perfect socialist example where everyone is valued, where everyone has an equal chance, that the rest of the world observing this is going to want to copy it, going to want to emulate it. It was never the intention of the members of People's Temple to support violent revolution or upheaval, to force anyone to believe what they believed, to act as they did. The idea was we are going to live in the way we think is most appropriate, and people will see this and they will want to do the same thing.
So when did he become batshit crazy? Or does he?
I don't think Jim Jones at any point was so clinically mentally ill that it would have been something that would have taken him out of the regular picture. Nobody's normal. Every one of us has certain quirks. Aren't we glad that we're not discussing those in detail today? But bear in mind, this is a man who is a megalomaniac, who is given to lying and trying to con people into doing what he wants from childhood. It becomes a heavy abuser of drugs. Amphetamines particularly increase paranoia. He's a demagogue, and one of the great assets of demagogues is they can convince themselves at that moment that what they're saying must be true, and he sets himself up, he gets in a position, finally, where there is no one who is going to say you're wrong. Anytime you don't hear any other opinion than your own, where everything you hear is praise, that you're perfect, you're wonderful, it has an effect. Drugs, megalomania, it's a combination, the whole combination worked, and incrementally he becomes more and more and more of almost a caricature of what he was to begin with. But again, when we say his followers must have been stupid to buy into any of this, we do them a disservice.
No, from your book, I was very clear that you did not cheapen these people, you did not treat them like simpletons, I think is the word I used in the review. I felt like you had great empathy toward the people who followed him in some respect.
Well, here's the odd thing. This is my 19th book. And in researching this book and talking to those who had been part of People's Temple and associated, never in any book project have I met more people that I want to be friends with the rest of my life. And I'm doing that. You know how I'm decompressing after, I finish this book tour? And I've been thinking about Jim Jones and People's Temple for over 3 years, 24/7. Three of the guys that I've met in this book, who in one way or another are associated with it, and I are meeting in California to go to a San Francisco Giants baseball game, because we're all such great baseball fans. And I think probably that whole day we'll never talk about People's Temple once. We're talking about human beings of great quality. And that is what makes the tragedy so much worse. The people who died that day in Guyana, if they had lived, had so much to contribute, who would have spent their lives trying so hard to benefit the lives of others. No one ever joined People's Temple to get something. We joined to give. And when we say don't drink the Kool-Aid, it wasn't Kool-Aid, it's an insult to their memories. They deserve better than that. Sorry, I get on it.
No, you're...
But I really care about that. It really matters to me.
You're old enough to have been a part of People's Temple. I'm just a tad, I was 11 when the thing happened. But you're older than I am, and you could have been a member. Do you wish you had been?
I was interviewing a man named Tim Carter up in Oregon. Tim is a survivor. He was in Jonestown that day. He saw his 14-month-old son die. He saw his wife die. He would probably, he thinks, have died in his turn if he hadn't been pulled out and told, Jim has an errand for you. And you'll read in the book his first-hand description of that. But Tim was talking about how he was searching when he was a young man, and how he finally ends up hearing a sermon by Jim Jones, and it seems like Jones is saying everything that Tim believes, and so he will join People's Temple. I went to UT Austin, and I was always a very socially active young guy. I really cared about things, I would get involved in social causes. And People's Temple at this time, Jim Jones and a lot of people would get in Greyhound buses, and they'd be traveling all over the country. And I found myself realizing that, okay, I'm 18, 19 years old, Austin, Texas. Kind of frustrated with the way things were, not understanding why they had to be that way. If Jim Jones had shown up in town for one of his meetings and I had gone. And he started talking about how unfair it is to judge people by their possessions, by their gender, by the color of their skin. I don't know that I would have said, hey, I want to get on the bus and go with you. I might have considered it. I would hope if I did that, once I had more exposure to him, I would have said, wait a minute, this is not what it appeared to be, and I'm backing away. But I do know I would have been intrigued. And how can I condemn other people for feeling the same way?
Now, Jones, you use the term demagogue, but, but no demagogue exists without enablers. And he had a ton of people willing to help him.
Well, we're going to get to the part of the program now. In recent weeks, I've been doing a lot of media. And I have talked about this on places like Fresh Air with Terry Gross, maybe some of you listen, on Hardball with Chris Matthews. And day before yesterday, I got into a fierce debate with a guy named Don Imus on the radio about it.
I don't know how that happened.
Why? You know, we're all here tonight, and again, most of us are old enough to at least have some memory of when this happened. And there are a couple of young people here who are very bravely hanging in and hoping I'll tell some kind of story that might actually be interesting. I don't blame you for feeling that way. But why is it even important to write a book, let alone read one, about something that happened 39 years ago in this isolated part of the world where the majority of the people who remember it think of it as some idiot leader and his brainless followers doing something that defies understanding. But there are reasons. When Jim Jones sat in Jonestown in his comfortable chair on the stage of the pavilion where he'd call everybody together, there's a sign hanging over his head. And it said, those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. And that's true. In a lot of ways, we don't learn from history, particularly with demagogues. Let me preface this by saying demagogues come in every political stripe, every religious or atheistic belief. It's never just from one spectrum or another. Demagogues can be anywhere. Jim Jones was a demagogue who was certainly liberal, even socialist in his outlook. But here are the things that every demagogue does. And as I'm writing this book and doing my research, I am realizing this is textbook. The demagogue will always say, I am the only one who can solve this problem. I am the only one who can lead you. The second thing a demagogue will do is sometimes directly, sometimes gradually, will try to teach his followers that there are only two sides. There are those of us who believe the right things, and there are the enemy. He's trying to divide. And demagogues will even try to separate their followers from family members, other friends. Because the third thing any demagogue does, try to cut out opposing opinions, whether they're in print, in the media, speeches, books, people who have been part of the organization and are out of it. It's always, they're making it up, it's lies, the only truth, the only facts that matter are the ones I'm giving you. And finally, with every demagogue, and it is inevitable, they will lead their followers to some kind of bad end. You say every demagogue has enablers. It's true. But the word enabler in and of itself, I think, is misleading. If you have someone, and we'll use Jim Jones as the example, I believe there were many members of People's Temple who got fed up with Jim Jones's act. But they still believed in the purpose of People's Temple. And so they stay in spite of him. But there are also people, and they were there to the end. You can hear them on the tape made of that terrible afternoon in Jonestown, who do believe that Jim Jones is more than a man, that he is a leader who cannot be questioned. Is enabler the same thing as true believer?
Actually, I was referring to people like Willie Brown, Moscone, people who...
Oh, we'll get to them. I'm talking about the folks within People's Temple who rose to leadership
And
positions.
Marcy.
Marcelin Baldwin Jones is one of the saddest figures I've ever written about. She was, I think, in every way a good, decent human being who was overjoyed by the concept that she would be able to use her religion, her heartfelt belief in God, to be able to better the lives of people in need. She was treated as horribly by her husband as I think almost a woman can be. She did twice in her life try to get away from him, and the first time she's talked out of it by her mother, and the second time she's pretty much emotionally blackmailed out of it by Jim Jones, who says if she leaves him, she loses her children. And at the end, and we know this from Tim Carter, who was there and watching, as things are starting to happen in Jonestown, Marcelin Jones is standing apart and screaming, "You can't do this, you can't do this," and the last words in that tape before it runs out, Jim Jones saying, "Mother, mother, mother." And that he was father in People's Temple and she was mother. We also know now from Tim Carter, who heard the conversation behind the pavilion beforehand, he had told Marcelin that her sons in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, had already killed themselves. And that so she was going to be joining these children that she loved. God, he was a terrible man in so many ways.
Well, when you're talking about him, and when I was reading the book, I kept thinking, less, the word demagogue is important, but I just kept thinking of this guy is your prototypical abuser. He treated his whole congregation like an abused spouse. They were there to sate his, at the end, they were there just to sate his lusts.
The cruelest thing you can do is abuse people who trust you and who you believe will forgive you no matter what you do to them. Yes, he was an abuser, but let's remember that he's had time to incrementally make so many of these people believe in the middle of a dense jungle. And folks, I had been there. The jungle has overgrown Jonestown now. And we really did cut our way through with machetes. I had not understood until I did that the tremendous achievement of those who cut People's Temple out of that jungle and turned it into a working farm. Let's think there are about 900 people in Jonestown, right? And the children can't work out in the fields, the older people can't, but you've got a core group of maybe 250, 300 people working as hard as human beings can. And many of them have never so much as mowed a lawn in civilian life. They carve out this farm. It's been 39 years. In those years, the Guyanese government has made 16 attempts, count them, 16, to start some kind of similar farm community in that jungle. None lasted over 3 months. That's the kind of leader, even at his worst, Jim Jones was. He could inspire even when he was reprehensible. I would not have known that if I hadn't had to go out there myself. That's one of the reasons we do these things. I know a lot of this sounds like almost an apology for Jim Jones. Please don't take it as such. I don't excuse the things he did. They were terrible. It's made worse by the fact that he had the potential to inspire people to so many positive things. But in the end, you get a man who is paranoid, who is delusional, who is determined that he must be famous, he must be powerful, he must be remembered, who at some points has preached about Masada. Does everybody remember Masada here? Sure. In ancient history, the Jewish rebels, they're on a mountaintop. The powerful Roman army is moving towards them, and they're building a road up the mountain, and every day the road gets closer. And just as the road's about to connect, and the Roman soldiers will overrun the fort, the people of Masada, men, women, and children, kill themselves as a gesture of defiance. And he's alluded to this. Once in a meeting of his top counselors, and once calling the people of Jonestown together. He has had them drink something, telling them it was poison and they were going to die.
Suicide drills.
Only to say later, no, there wasn't poison, but you've proven you're loyal. Now you have him in the jungle. These people have been cut off from any outside news. All they're hearing at night, Jim Jones likes to speak. He'll talk about things like the first concentration camps for blacks in America have just been opened. And we go, oh, how could that be? Think, you have people of color there who are old enough to remember the burning crosses and the lynchings. And during World War II, the internment camp for Japanese Americans who had done nothing against their country. I talked to a couple people who were teenagers then who said Jones would tell them about Kent State. The U.S. Army came in and mowed down rich, spoiled white kids who were protesting the war. Well, you're poor, and you're out here and you're protesting the war. What do you think they'll do to you? As his paranoia grows, as he believes at some level, the United States government, the CIA, the FBI, mercenaries could come in at any time, he's trying to make everybody else believe this. And at least they have some sense of persecution, and it might happen. There's child custody battles in the courts. And there's a real danger that Jim Jones's biological child, John Victor Stone, will be taken away from him. And Jones is convincing parents, if they do that, if they take him, your child's coming next. So they're afraid too. And they have no other voice to hear. And then Leo Ryan appears. Can I tell about Leo Ryan?
We were going to get there, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
You guys know who Leo Ryan is, right? The congressman who was gunned down.
Right, he was a congressman from the Bay Area, and he gets complaints from constituents that some of their family members are in Jonestown being held against their will. They can tell from letters and trying to reach them. And Ryan finally agrees to go and try to find out and inspect. I interviewed a man named Jim Wright for this book. Jim Wright, as you know, for a while was Speaker of the House of Representatives. At the time, he was Majority Leader in Congress. And he actually brought out the notes he had kept at the time about his conversations with Leo Ryan. Ryan said, look, I think I'm going to go to Jonestown. Jim Jones will not let me in. And since he won't let me in, I can come back to America and we will start an official congressional investigation. And if we have to bring troops in to liberate people, we'll do it. So Jim Jones, in a sad sense, was right. I mean, there was that danger that the soldiers might come.
Just because you're paranoid.
Right. So Ryan gathers some members of the media, a couple of members of his staff, and some members of the group calling themselves Concerned Relatives. They fly to Guyana. And on Friday, May the 17th, Leo Ryan and most of the group are allowed in. By the next afternoon, Leo Ryan believes that out of over 900 people in Jonestown, 15 want to leave with him. He doesn't know that 11 others have already left earlier that morning, and Jones is aware of this. Ryan isn't. But even so, 26 people out of more than 900. Ryan tells at least 2 people who are members of People's Temple and are living in Jonestown, and I've talked to them both separately, so it's not like they got together to say, oh yeah, this will happen, that Leo Ryan told them, as far as he was concerned, Jim Jones had proved his point. Ryan would go back to America and say, out of all these people, only 15 wanted to leave, and they were given their passports and money. I don't think anybody's being held against their will. Jim Jones was going to win. But then there's Jim Jones's side of it. If one congressman comes in and takes away 15 of your people, or 26, somebody else is going to come, and more of them are going to go. A lot of the people here who are on the fence, whether they want to stay or not, they're going to decide they want to go. what's going to happen when Jim Jones, who's run to Guyana because he's been found out in lots of investigative stories in California, if he's left by himself in the middle of the jungle with very few followers? He's a laughingstock, and this is a megalomaniac. I think Jim Jones, by this point, has stopped thinking of himself as the shepherd and his followers as the flock. He thinks he's a general battling the outside world, and the people of Jonestown are his troops. And everyone knows, of course, that generals must sacrifice their troops sometime. And so that's what's going to happen. Lee O'Ryan, the 15 so-called defectors, media, concerned relatives, on a truck heading back to a little airstrip 6 miles away. Jones sends armed men after them on a tractor. They attack at the airstrip. The people being attacked are unarmed. 5 people die, including Lee O'Ryan. Others are grievously wounded. The tractor comes back to report. Meanwhile, in Jonestown, everyone's been called to the pavilion. They don't know what's going to happen, and even when Jones starts talking about how much I have loved you, this is not going to be suicide, it's a revolutionary act. Still, many of them, I think, believe it's just Jim doing it again, trying to sort of bring us to the brink and pull us back. And he tells them it's just going to be simple. You're just going to step over. There's a tape. You can listen to it on the internet if you want to.
You know, while all this is going on, he's had his followers, his inner circle, creating the vats of punch, and there's been a run-up to
Right.
this.
It's not Kool-Aid, it's Flavor Aid.
Right.
They mix in cyanide and tranquilizers. And Jones promises that it's just an easy thing. You're going to drink this and you're going to just like falling asleep. And he thinks that the children should go first, the infants. And he says we can let the parents go with their children and be merciful. But see, here's the thing that Jones hasn't really figured out yet. Death by cyanide poisoning is one of the most painful ways to die. It robs the body of the ability to absorb oxygen. You go into convulsions, you froth at the mouth, and you slowly suffocate. And from these first infants, this is happening. You can hear Jones on the tape saying, no, they're not crying, it just tastes a little bitter. And then you can hear him on the tape saying, this is not the way socialists should act. And everybody's going to remember this. And it is true on that day that some of those followers who really believed in Jim Jones are doing this voluntarily. You can hear them on the tape. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for all you did. We're going to go forward. Jim Jones Jr., who was not there that day, he was in Georgetown, but who I think would all agree would have very good insights into his father and the people there, said he thinks a lot of people went ahead and drank the poison. These are Jimmy's words, not mine, because they were so damn tired. They were exhausted emotionally. A lot of them had bought into the fact that these soldiers are coming because Jones has told them the congressman's dead. Fine. Give me the damn stuff. We'll get it over with. But there were also many who resisted. There were armed guards. When I was in Guyana, I was able to find the coroner's reports, which had been stashed in the National Library and not looked at for almost 38 years. And the Guyanese coroner, who was the first one on the spot, estimates that at least 4 dozen and as many as over 100 people resisted. They were forcibly injected with the poison. He said you could tell because they would have an abscess on their bodies. Some of the abscesses were in their neck or their hands or their foot or their leg if they were trying to kick and get away. One man was injected in his temple. So this wasn't a matter of people just calmly going to their doom.
It was murder-suicide.
It wasn't really even murder-suicide, it was mass murder.
And in the other part that's fascinating about that is these people went to Guyana to create this safe zone, right? They were told that they needed to find a place to survive the nuclear holocaust, to be protected from the Armageddon that was sure to happen, and that was true throughout his
Well, he
teachings,
would use
right?
that, but towards the end, he's telling them they're coming to a jungle paradise. They didn't know what it was going to be like. It's fair to say that a few of the folks in Jonestown loved it, and there were plenty of people who hated every second they were living there. But again, this is their refuge. This is where they are going to finally do this thing, and the outside world is held at bay. Until Jones told them that wasn't true anymore.
So if Jones were alive today, what would he be doing? What would his accomplishments be?
Don Imus, this one's for you. I have gathered and I have read just over 4,000 newspaper articles written about Jim Jones or Jim Jones and People's Temple during their time in California. And Jones has risen to a place in power where every big name politician is sucking up to him and People's Temple. They want Jim Jones's support. On a Sunday, you might look out in the crowd and there'd be the lieutenant governor or the mayor of San Francisco. That's Angela Davis in the back, the great revolutionary. Laura Allende, the sister of that martyred leader in Chile, and on one supreme occasion, right there in the back, that seat right there, yes, that one, it's Jane Fonda. And Jane Fonda even wrote a letter about how this is what the church should be, and you better believe Jones was passing that around. Jones is around political leaders who hold high office, and they are coming to him. Years ago, and I'm not comparing this man to Jim Jones, but I had a long interview with Jimmy Carter after he left office at his home in Plains, Georgia. I said, can you tell me why in 1974, you're sort of an obscure governor, you decide you want to be president of the United States? And he said, well, all the other candidates came by to ask me to support them, and I realized I was smarter than any of them. Jim Jones is seeing up close officials in high elective office. And suddenly, just before the bad stories start to hit the press, in almost every profile of Jim Jones, you see these lines. Pastor Jones says for the present he is not interested in seeking elective office. He prefers now to concentrate on the programs of People's Temple. He does not know if he will ever seek office. I think if Jim Jones had not been run out of California to Guyana, he would have run for office in California. I think he would have tried to be mayor of San Francisco, and he could have done it. I can see him running for governor of California and getting there. And as recent events have proven, you can get some surprises being elected president of the United States. And Jim Jones, the man who said he was the reincarnation of God, does not aim low, folks. If he were alive today, he would have brought people into People's Temple who were masters of social media, and People's Temple would have been everywhere. Cable television, where you can have your own broadcast, I think he would have done it. And I really think, by now, he would have risen to political prominence. Remember, this is the man saying, I'm the only one who can solve the problem. Everybody else is the enemy. Don't listen to any contradictory outside interference. It's proven it works. I'm not saying that demagogues are one political extreme or the other, but I'm saying all demagogues have certain characteristics. He had them, and he was getting interested in politics. And if that doesn't scare the hell out of all of you, it should.
Now, you say this, but that's knowing about the tent revival, the sleight of hands, the huckster personality that he would turn on and off at will. Did you think he could have overcome that as well?
I'm not going to say
Trump
that,
never
but if you'd like to
flung
say
eggs
it.
at somebody, but okay.
Remember, so much then and now is not based on facts, but the way people can present themselves and gain attention without too much scrutiny. And then you get to the point, Jim Jones rose to power in a cycle in American history where we were deeply divided among ourselves. And he used that. Demagogues use current events and exaggerate them to make the danger seem even more extreme and immediate. Anytime, any country, including this one, is so divided politically, in terms of religion, in terms of culture, that's when demagogues can rise up. It's happened before, it's happening now. When are we going to pay attention to the words that were on that sign over Jim Jones's head? When can we start learning from history? So if you ask me, as I know you are going to, Jeff, what are the absolute two basic reasons that you must read about People's Temple, about Jonestown, about Jim Jones? Two things. First, that the people who died there were decent human beings and deserve our respect, not ridicule. And second, demagogues will always lead their followers to a bad end. Let's be a little more careful, please. That's what I got to say. Does anybody have any questions, I guess? Let's start with you.
Do you see any parallels in our society today outside of politics, which could come up? Do you see any religious leaders or any other segment of society where people are drawn in any of the religions out of fear?
Jim Jones used to openly mock what he called the preachers in their $1,000 suits and Cadillacs. And he would recruit by saying, look, I just wear ordinary clothes and I don't even have a car. Religion accomplishes great things. I'm a member of a church back in Fort Worth. I take my life in my hands by teaching the junior high Sunday school class. And let me tell you, 11 and 12-year-olds are dangerous when you gather them together. When we say that there are some moments perhaps when religion is used in an obsessive way or in some suppressive way, that doesn't discount all the good. But yeah, sure, there's examples. Each of us may think something different is the example, but yes, I think there are.
You haven't mentioned it yet, but I'm sure this came to mind, and I can't remember the scientist's name, but that famous experiment with the authoritarian lab scientist who got people to shock others they thought. Yes. I mean, so I think one of the reasons there is a theme is because there's an essential human behavioral element that gets utilized by these people, and this has come up in analyses of certain individuals now that they appeal to people who want authoritarian leaders and to be told what to do. So did you?
I think that all of us
in?
as human beings want to believe. We all want to think that at some point life can get better, we can do things better, our own lives can improve, and we all look to find someone who will seem to lead us in that direction, who says the things we want to believe.
But as you recall, in this experiment, the actors were shocked by the test subjects, even when the needle said potentially lethal, because the scientist was telling them they made the wrong choice. You must give them. It was obviously used for the Nazi.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is, we have the capacity to believe. We have the capacity to condemn. There are a lot of us who enjoy the capacity of wanting to punish. Human nature is not going to change, but I think the way we examine things before we step into them needs to. I'm an advocate not of liberalism or conservatism, but of common sense myself. Reading this book scared the hell out of me. It did for a couple of reasons. The things people will do not only to each other but to themselves. And the other big weakness, I think, and all of us have this. This has nothing to do with your question, but I think it's important. Can I add it?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people who follow a demagogue, and the demagogue, and they put aside their families if they have to. They base their friendships on it. If you don't believe what I believe, you can't be friends with me anymore. They may give up their homes, their possessions. They may, live someplace they hadn't intended to live. Then maybe one day they think, hold on, was I wrong? And human pride won't let you admit it. Maybe I was wrong, but if I say so, then I'm going to be humbled in front of everybody else that I argued with. I will have given up all these things for nothing. I think a lot of people stick with proven false demagogues out of hubris. You just don't want to let your pride be attacked that way. A lot of the people in Jonestown may have thought Jim Jones had turned out to be a nut, and they wish they weren't in the jungle. But he had their passports, he had their money. What are they going to do? Finally call home to their parents and say, Mama, I was right, come rescue me? A lot of people would say, hell no, I'm going to stay here, I'm going to see it through. It's human emotions are a mess, we all are, it's complicated. But again, I think we can study Jonestown and what happened there, and there's some warning signs maybe we can apply them in life.
Do you think that, as you discussed Jim Jones and how he digressed, do you think that had he not been on drugs, that maybe he wouldn't have gone to that extreme?
We know now that from childhood he was a liar. We know that he was a con artist. If he hadn't been on drugs fuel paranoia, particularly amphetamines. But I think the real danger with Jim Jones was not the fact that the drugs were working. He was a megalomaniac. He was a demagogue. He had the ability, anytime he said something, he could sound sincere, because while he was saying it, he could believe it. That's why I'm a greater historian than David McCullough. And I'm telling you that now, and I can believe it while I say it. If you put our books side by side, maybe not. I picked David because he and I have the same editor at Simon & Schuster, which means I'm never going to be number one. But Jim Jones, all the weird things he's saying, most of the time I think while he's saying them, he's absolutely buying into them. If Leo Ryan hadn't come to Guyana that day, there still would have been something. He was getting ready for this big final moment. And for him, the only way to absolutely triumph is if everybody else is willing to die for him, all his followers. That's why he just didn't say, whoever wants to drink the stuff, go ahead, and the rest of you, I hope the jaguars out there eat you alive. No, they would be held down and ejected because, damn it, when those people came in the next day, and as they were going to do with Leo Ryan dead, they were going to see a heap of dead bodies that people would be talking about for all of eternity, or at least 39 years. And in that sick, sorry way, Jim Jones succeeded.
In all your research, I imagine you read a lot of books. I'm sure you watched the Powers Booth movie, which kind of haunted my childhood. By the way, I have a connection to the whole thing. My uncle was part of the body recovery effort. He worked for the Air Force, and he was part of the team that went down there and moved the bodies to Dover. And I just learned that when we were talking about your book. But in all this, did you ever read anything that you thought, that you thought was worthy? Was the TV movie worthy? Was it all crap?
Let me say this about that. I saw that TV movie. Next question. Sir, you got
a question. Did you come across the name Tim Stone at all?
Oh, yeah.
And one other question, you don't have to go into it, but I'd like to know sometime. And the other question was, whatever happened to all the money?
Here's an interesting thing. The government learned after the fact that People's Temple had about $30 million in various accounts, many of them foreign accounts. And they tried to get the money back because they wanted People's Temple to have to pay for the process of getting all the bodies and interment and so forth. And ultimately they raised about $14 million. You read in the book, that I spent a lot of time with a woman named Terry Buford. And Terry Buford was one of the people in charge of Temple finances, working under Tim Stone, by the way. And Terry said that she helped set up a lot of accounts in banks in Switzerland and Panama, and that only Jim Jones knew all of those. And Jim Jones, as much as he'd make fun of the Bible, had a personal Bible that he kept in his cottage in Jonestown. And Terry and the others, when they'd set up the latest foreign account, would put the code numbers of the account and the passwords written along the spine of one of the chapters of the Bible, so that if Jim Jones ever needs his money, he can open that up and there's the information. The Guyanese government put together a report of everything they found in Jonestown, but admitted there was some looting by soldiers. One of the things they never found was the Bible. Somewhere, some elderly former member of the Guyanese Defense Force, when he takes out the beat-up old Bible that he took from Jonestown, saying, I wonder why somebody scribbled all over these pages. There's about $16 million still in foreign accounts that's been drawing interest. If any of you have decided, now Robert, this could be my birthday present to you. You are one of the best investigative reporters in the country. And you take this on, and you find that money, you can quit your day job, buddy.
There it is.
Though I think a finder's fee to me would be appropriate. But the money
I'll
is
kick back.
still out there. There is no question. And of course, those foreign banks are not gonna say, hey, wait a minute, we've got this account. If you think of interest right now, interest rates, you know, all of us could each have $5 or $6 million. In fact, I'll split it with you. If one of you finds it, we'll all, but anyway, yes, the money's out there.
Okay, yeah, 'cause I didn't know, 'cause I had known Tim for quite extensively, and
The money's out there.
the money's, yeah, there was a lot of things with the money, like people he knew had a lot of money that didn't really have it before, and it's like, that money's never really been accounted for, and
Yep.
do you write much in your book on Tim?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Kind of a tragic story, Tim.
It's a story, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have a question and a comment. The comment is, as a mother, reading about the mothers giving the syringes of the poison to their children is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever read.
It's one of the,
Hands
I was
down.
crying while I was writing.
It was, it's unbelievable that this could have happened. But the question I have is, Jim Jones was shot. How do you think that happened?
We know of all the bodies found that day, that only 2 did not die from cyanide poisoning. One was Jim Jones, the other was his personal nurse, Annie Moore, and both of them were shot in the head. The tape ran out before Jim Jones died, so we have no way of knowing. My guess, based on all the documents, all the things I've seen, Annie's letters to her parents about worshiping Jones, Jim Jones was a physical coward from the time he was a little kid. And I think watching the suffering of these other people, he didn't want to be part of that. I think Annie probably was given the honor of shooting him and then being able to die herself in the same way, that special thing. I don't know that.
Okay.
I think so. But Jim Jones being shot in the head, of course, led itself to a lot of conspiracy theories later that was an imposter and everything else. I also have read the autopsies that were done by the U.S. government. Jones was positively identified by his dental records and his fingerprints. That was Jim Jones. He's not out there somewhere. You know,
Not
and you know,
conforming with Elvis, though.
I still think you ought to try to find that money. You could.
Yeah.
I do have one question that just kind of, when I read the book, I just felt like I never got the answer. When he was so successful in Indianapolis, he took this jaunt to Brazil, this kind of detour. It was really kind of a mistake. If he ever made a mistake beyond what happened in Guyana, it was this move to Brazil. Why? He was at the peak of his power in Indianapolis. Why go to Brazil?
Okay, now we have to go back to the late 1950s, and again, I'm the only one old enough to have been there. The rest of you use your imagination. America at the time was petrified the idea of nuclear war. We lived with it constantly. I'm old enough, some of you are, would have the air raid drills in the school, and you'd hide under your desk like that was going to help you.
Yeah.
Demagogues have to prophesize. They have to convince their followers there are great dangers. Jim Jones was personally scared of atomic fallout. And if you think he shouldn't be scared, you've got President Kennedy in 1960 in a press conference saying that in the event of nuclear war, most people should try to find shelter in schools. Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York, trying to put in the state budget money for everybody to have a fallout shelter under their home. There's the Cuban Missile Crisis. We are living day to day with not only the fear but almost the expectation that somebody's going to push the button and we're going to die that way. Jim Jones keeps careful track of current events, and this is one that affects him. And he reads in a popular magazine that there are only 9 places on Earth that if there is nuclear fallout, you ought to be safe because of the different winds that would blow things away. And he wants to move from Indiana anyway, People's Temple, because he's telling people you just can't get enough done in Indiana. These people don't care enough to really try to force cultural change. And he has the idea that he will move People's Temple to somewhere on Earth where when the bomb drops, they're going to be safe. And a place in Brazil is one of those listed. And he actually moved there with his family for about a year and a half to try to see if he can bring People's Temple there, and it doesn't work. So he comes back to the States, and then they go to Redwood Valley, which is another one of the 9 places. They only moved to San Francisco after we're getting by that daily sort of pressure. And Jones, he was afraid of a lot of things. Some correctly, all of us who are old enough, we remember we were afraid of that. So it seems perfectly legitimate that he's going to try to take his church and go where that wouldn't happen.
Current politics notwithstanding, we may get another chance to be afraid of that.
Well, you have to be careful. I've been saying these same things. I said this on Fresh Air, and I get all these Facebook messages from people. Oh, I'm so glad someone has the courage to talk about Donald Trump. Then I was on a big radio talk show in the Northwest a couple days later, and the producer actually thanked me for having the courage to warn everybody about Barack Obama. I'm not saying that the demagogues and the things they do are from one area, one political pole or another. But yeah, I'm scared right now, and some of the things that scare me come from things I learned from this book. I can't deny that. Okay, we better be quick because what they want me to do now is sign books and clear out.
I just want to make,
They don't need to be inhospitable, but yeah.
I just have a quick comment. I just want to say you enlightened me about the people who gravitated to the People's Temple, because I had always had the impression these were people who were mostly down on their luck and needed somebody to lift them up.
And some of them were, but not in any way, any means all of them, or even the greater percentage.
Okay.
I'm always honored to come here. This is a wonderful store. Please, always when you can, support independent bookstores, and the Poison Pen in particular is a very special place. These are nice folks who really care about books and their customers. I thank you for coming tonight. I'm working on a new book. Maybe in 2 years we can all meet again. In the meantime...
Can you say what it's about?
Well, I could, but they want me to go.
Okay.
And so we shall, but I'd be happy to sign books for anyone who would like one. Thank you.